Welcome to the Bible Feed, another episode, another podcast. I'm Dan Weatherall and I'm here with Paul Davenport. Good to be with you again, Paul.
Hi, Dan. Yeah.
Good
to be doing this again.
Yeah, it's good. We're looking forward to this. We're going to start a little bit of a series, actually, which is good, a little mini-series. We like doing that. And this takes us right back to the opening moments of this podcast, Paul, when you and I, we had a discussion about prophecy and faith. So what was that all about?
Yeah, so this was back in 2020, wasn't it? This was, I don't know, must have been our lockdown project or something. But yeah, so our first episode was prophecy and faith. And I think we particularly looked at Daniel chapter 2 and the image of, or sometimes it's called Nebuchadnezzar's image in Daniel chapter 2. And we were really exploring whether prophecy was something that brought people to believe or whether prophecy was really for someone who had already believed. And that kind of classic question about the prophetic parts of the Bible, and particularly the Old Testament. Are the prophets speaking to the faithful now that have already committed to the faith? Or are they just revealing something for everyone that is a roadmap for the future? And I think we concluded that it was the first of those. Really, this was something for the faithful.
Oh, okay, great. So you just reminded me of what we talked about then. Thank you, which is good. If any listener hasn't heard that, you can go right back to the beginning and listen to how much more polished we are, listen to the changes in equipment that we've had and everything like that. So this kind of begs the question, why have you proposed this little mini-series, Paul? So what we're hoping to do now is a little short series on prophets, on what is a prophet, particularly in this first step of this episode here. Yeah. What is a prophet, or who were the prophets? So that's sort of question that we're trying to answer. And if we've already answered it, why are we doing this?
It's come about really because we've been doing these short book overview episodes, and we've done Genesis, Exodus, and so on through the Torah. And we're now getting into the section of the Hebrew Bible that is called the prophets. And so I thought, okay, good idea to do a little introduction on what is a prophet, who were the prophets, and then follow that up with a few episodes, particularly about Isaiah, and then take a little look at the minor prophets. So hopefully what we can do in this episode is set the scene for that and clarify just what books of the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible, are we talking about when we talk about the prophet.
Okay, great. So that's the aim. A little mini-series about prophets, but this little intro will help us tick off a few more of those books that we're going through slowly but surely.
And the minor prophets, we hit 12 all at once.
Exactly, that's why we're doing them, Paul. Yeah, that's right. Okay. So while we're on that, I'm going to start off. I'm just going to read an extract from Amos, okay? One of those minor prophets, Amos chapter 4. Let's just get into the groove and feel what we're letting ourselves in for with these prophets. So this is Amos chapter 4, reading from verse 1. Hear this word, you cows of Bashan, who are on the mountain of Samaria, who oppress the poor, who crush the needy, who say to your husbands, bring that we may drink. The Lord God has sworn by his holiness that, behold, the days are coming upon you, when they shall take you away with hooks, even the last of you with fish hooks, and you shall go out through the breaches, each one straight ahead, and you shall be cast out into Harmon, declares the Lord. Okay.
Well read.
Thank you. Move aside, David Suchet. But that's a little bit obscure, isn't it? That's typical, isn't it? What we find when we open different parts of the prophet.
Yeah, and that's just 3 verses. And it's quite, okay, what's going on? He's talking to cows, and there's fish and fish hooks. What's really going, is this really about cows? And it's quite unfamiliar in the language and just the type of writing. It's a little bit poetic, but it's not the kind of poetry that we're used to. And we're reading it in English. That was the English Standard Version, I think, that you read out. So it's a translation of Hebrew, and that brings with it, particularly when it's a translation of Hebrew poetic type writing, that brings a whole load of challenges as to what is this about. I'm guessing it's not about cows and their bad behaviour.
I'm hoping you're going to do more than guessing, Paul. You're going to tell us the answers.
Yeah, but there's references to places like Samaria and this place called Harmon, if that's even a place, or is it the meaning of the name that's relevant? So there's a lot to, just in 3 verses there, you can see that's quite a job to get underneath what's going on here. Yeah,
so is there even a modern equivalent in the type of writing, the genre of this writing? So you skirted around poetry, saying it's some kind of Hebrew poetry, but not really what we're used to. But it's not just like a nice book of poems. The prophets aren't pure poetry, are they? What else are they? Is there?
Yeah, they're quite a stroppy bunch in the way that they write, and the way that they use really quite colourful language about the people that they're attacking often. So in the Bible, we have narrative, we have stories that unfold, and we're familiar with that. We have characters, so they're set in a certain place. There's an issue, there's a tension, there's a plot, and then it's resolved. And so we have that, and we understand how to read that. There are biographies, there's the lives of Jesus in the Gospels, there's letters. We understand what a letter is and how to think about who was sending it and who were they sending it to. Poetry we're familiar with, but not necessarily so familiar with the form of Hebrew poetry. But often the prophets are attacking those that are in power, those that are in positions of power and in authority, and attacking them for their hypocrisy, for their injustice. And is there an equivalent to that? You talk about some journalists. Some journalism might think of itself as speaking truth to power and that sort of thing, but they don't do it in the language, in that kind of language. Oi, you cows. Not the sort of journalists that I tend to read and listen to anyway. So maybe there's some aspect in that sort of journalism, but I think there's some similarities with what we might see as protest movements or activist movements. Okay. I'll give you an example. I went to the Financial Times Global Insurance Summit.
Oh, wow. I bet that was
London.
Fun.
I'm living the dream. And just outside the conference centre, the building where this is being held, there was probably 5 or 6 mothers with their toddlers, and they'd set up on the pavement outside the conference centre like a little playground with slides and some other toys. But it was laid out on like a sheet that looked like the surface of water, and the slide looked like it was half submerged in water, and some of these other toys that the toddlers were just quite happily sitting there playing with. And they were stuck outside this insurance conference saying, look, insurers, you shouldn't be insuring oil and gas and fossil fuels, and the next generation are going to be flooded out and experience terrible consequences of climate change. So they're enacting something that's pointing out a message to, okay, come on, the system, the powers that be, those that are in control of things now are not really doing what they should do for the future. And we find the prophets doing some similar things, really. They enact and they act out some really quite punchy messages to those that are in power, saying consequences of what you're doing, be warned, it's coming, that kind of thing. So it's not a perfect analogy, but they're as close as we get to a modern equivalent to the work and the writings of the prophets.
Yeah, okay, yeah, because it's not all just text like I've just written, just words like that, but actually the prophets go and do things, do some quite shocking things. And it's for a point. It's powerful, isn't it? That's the point. Okay, so that's useful to have a little bit of idea about the kind of genre, the kind of text that we're working with. That little extract I read, you mentioned already, didn't you, about the different geography, the different places. Samaria I'm quite comfortable with. I can put that on a map. Not everyone will be able to, though. That's fine. But Bashan is a little bit not quite as familiar. And then Harmon as well, you said. But it is a feature, isn't it? When you read all the different prophets, there's various kings mentioned, various nations, various places. Yeah. And they're just assumed that you know this. And that's a little bit tricky, isn't it, sometimes? Yeah,
and it's what we might describe as high context material. And, just to explain a little bit about what I mean by that, if I was to say, coming home today, the traffic was terrible around the Dobbies Junction.
Okay.
Now, in order to understand what I mean by that, you need to know that Dobbies is a garden centre chain. Close by where I live, there's a junction and there's a garden centre there, and there's some roadworks going on there, and it's But that you need to know all of that. Actually, it's not called Dobbies.
I was going to say, the one.
It's actually Great British Garden Centres or something. And I should say, I'm not advocating any particular chain of garden centres. No, that others are available. But for me to say, the traffic was terrible at the Dobbies Junction, you need to actually know that before it was called what it is now, it was called Dobbies.
That's right.
At some point in the past. Yeah. So you need to know quite a lot. Whereas if on a traffic alert announcement, they say, at the junction of the A45 with the A4071, there's a terrible traffic jam. That's low context. Anyone can look at the A45 and look at that junction and find out where the problem is. And I'm afraid the prophets are very much like the Dobbies Junction approach. You need to understand and be familiar or get familiar with a fair amount of that history of the time. A lot of that's available in other parts of
Yeah.
the Bible, and some of it's helpful to add from sources outside the Bible to do with ancient history. But it's really important to understand a fair amount about that history. And that does mean that if you don't have that, it's perhaps easy to take things out of context and use them for their wrong purpose. There's another aspect which is perhaps worth bringing up at this point, which is that the prophet's role is really closely connected with the covenant history, the covenant between God and his people, and the prophets play a role within the history of that covenant.
Okay, it sounds like something that you're going to need to elaborate as we go forward. So that's useful. So basically, if you jump into the Bible for the very first time, having not known any of the history, and you pick up any part of the prophets, then you're likely to be scratching your head thinking what this is all about. And I think what you're saying is this fits. It's not just, they aren't just random bits of books that you can pick up and understand just on their own. They fit within a wider biblical history. Yeah. There is people at the time would have had that context, but for us, we need to build that up before we get there. So maybe just, that's partly what we've been doing, isn't it, in our introduction to different books, which we've done some of them and not done many of them at the moment. But maybe can you just sketch out that history that you're referring to, that history, that covenant history?
Yeah, and perhaps if we start with the beginning of Israel as a nation, it emerges out of slavery in Egypt. There's these slaves that escape from Egypt, and they're formed as a nation. They're in the wilderness in Sinai, and at Mount Sinai, there is this covenant. And we've been through some of that in the book overviews we've done in Exodus and Leviticus and so on. And so they come out of Egypt, they're formed as a nation, and the part of their forming of a nation is this covenant between God and the people. Then they get to the borders of the land after 40 years wandering in the wilderness. They get to the borders of the land, they cross the River Jordan, they go into the land, they conquer the land. And then there's a period, and we've talked about the Judges, the book of Judges. So they're not kings. There's a series of what are called judges. God is their king. This is the nature of the relationship, God and this people. God is their king, and there are judges. But then eventually there are kings, and two particular prominent kings, King David and King Solomon. And we haven't got to them yet in our book overviews, but they're pretty familiar names. King David and King Solomon, and 12 tribes of Israel, and those two kings were kings over all of those 12 tribes. Then after Solomon, the kingdom divided. There's a division between the tribes of Israel, and there's a northern kingdom and a southern kingdom, and the northern kingdom is 10 tribes, southern kingdom is 2 tribes, Judah and Benjamin in the south, and Jerusalem, which was David's capital city, King David's capital city. That's in the southern part in Judah. That's where the temple is. But the northern part, 10 tribes, is centered on Samaria. The city of Samaria is their capital. But then after a few hundred years of kings and this northern kingdom and the southern kingdom, there's a crisis. And it's the rise of the Assyrian Empire. And the Assyrians invade and they destroy that northern kingdom, the 10 tribes. They disperse the people, take captives, take slaves, and it's no longer a kingdom, an independent kingdom. And at that time, Judah, the southern kingdom, is also threatened, and it just about escapes the clutches of this Assyrian force. And so the kingdom of Judah carries on its own for another 100 years or so before there's another crisis. And this time it's Babylon, it's the Babylonians, Nebuchadnezzar. He comes and eventually takes Jerusalem, takes Judah, and the whole thing is overthrown. Captives are taken off to Babylon. Daniel, which is one of those captives. And we're not quite finished. We're near the end of the Old Testament now, but the last part of the Old Testament is after 70 years of being captive in Babylon. Babylon is overthrown by the Persians, and there's a decree to send the Jews back to Jerusalem and rebuild the city and reform that nation. And there's a chance to rebuild this little nation that has this special relationship with God. And that's where the Old Testament finishes.
Yeah, great. That's the most concise you've ever been, Paul. It's very good. Well done. The Old Testament in a nutshell. So that's a really helpful summary. So now we need to piece the prophets into that summary. Yeah. And you gave the game away a little bit with one of them, where you said Daniel, didn't you? You mentioned him at that moment of the Babylonian crisis. Yeah. So Daniel is typically a prophet, isn't he? So he's
Is he?
there we go. Let's put a pin in that.
Yeah.
He's there. When people think of people like the prophets and the prophetic writings, they're very often going to think of Daniel, aren't they? So there we go. But perhaps, Paul, there are earlier prophets. Let's piece the prophets into that history. Where do we find them?
Yeah, so the earliest prophet, the earliest person that's called a prophet is actually quite surprising because it's Abraham.
Oh, okay.
And Abraham has got into a situation with, I think it's a local king called Abimelech. And God speaks to this king and says, Abraham, my prophet. And he refers to Abraham as his prophet. So obviously it's a broader meaning than just the kind of thing you might associate with Daniel and the visions and maybe predictions that you'd associate with someone like Daniel. And so it's a broader meaning. But then after Abraham, we get to Moses, and we've talked a lot about Moses when we talked about the books of the Torah. Moses, the prophet, he's the key, big kind of prototype, archetypal prophet. He led the people from Egypt. And actually it's in Deuteronomy, there is this mysterious statement that after Moses, there will be another prophet that will be like him, that will arise at some future time.
So Moses comes from that first part of the Bible, doesn't he? He's there when that covenant is made with Israel, that covenant, the contract or promise that's made between God and the people of Israel. And he's very much associated with the Torah, or the Pentateuch. Sometimes they're even called the books of Moses, aren't they? So the first part of the Hebrew Bible. And then if you look at the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible in the Jewish order, you've then got another section called the Nevi'im, haven't you? The prophets. So that's what we're talking about, presumably. What does that include then?
Yeah, so we've got this whole collection of books that is just called the prophets. But it starts with, immediately after the Torah, with Joshua, with Judges, and we've done some overviews on them. It goes into Samuel, the books of Samuel and Kings. And we don't really think of them as prophets. They are historical narratives. But in amongst the narratives and the characters and the plot and the things that are going on in those narratives, we've got the prophets. The prophets are characters that play a role in that narrative. And the familiar names might be Elijah, the prophet, and Elisha.
Yeah, okay. And then maybe more unfamiliar names like Nathan, the prophet, speaking to David and so on. So yeah, there's more of them there. So that's interesting. Okay. And so people like Elijah, if you just said to me, Elijah, I think of trying to bring the people back to God, the God of the Old Testament, Yahweh, when they're going off worshipping Baal or those sorts of things. Yeah. So there's the incident with the prophets of Baal, that kind of thing.
Yeah. So they fulfill this role, which is very much talking to the people about stop going off and worshipping other things and come back to worshipping God. At the end of that period of the kings, when they're finally taken off in captivity by the Babylonians, there's a little summary of what the prophets did during this period. At the end of the second book of Chronicles, so 2nd of Chronicles 36, verse 15 and 16 says, "The Lord, the God of their fathers, sent persistently to them by his messengers," that's these prophets, "because he had compassion on his people and on his dwelling place. But they kept mocking the messengers of God, despising his words and scoffing at his prophets, until the wrath of the Lord rose against his people, until there was no remedy." So there's this complex relationship between God and his people. He's sending messengers. He's wanting them to kind of remain faithful to him and to the covenant that he's made with them. And the prophets are the messengers of God in bringing the people back, or trying to bring the people back into a proper relationship with God. You might call them their champions of the covenant, or maybe even sometimes enforcers of the covenant, and saying that you're going to be disciplined in order to bring you back. And so it's really wrapped around this concept of the covenant. The work of the prophets is embedded in this thing that is the covenant. And we're going to have to do another episode on what is a covenant in the Bible. But I'm just going to give one kind of very quick point about this covenant that God has with his people, because it's unique in some ways. It has some similarities with other covenants between peoples, between human beings, but it has one peculiar feature in it that when it's made with Abraham, the way this covenant is confirmed is by chopping animals in half. And what's supposed to happen is the two parties to the covenant walk between these pieces of the covenant as a kind of a sign that's saying, if either of you break this covenant, then what's going to happen to you is what's happened to these animals, and if one of them breaks it, the covenant is annulled and it's ended. But when this happens with Abraham, it's only a thing that represents God that goes between the parts of the sacrifice of the animals, as though God is the one that is going to continually keep this covenant going, even if the human part of the covenant completely messes up. They didn't pass between the pieces of the animals, and so the covenant isn't broken, even though human beings fail to keep their part of the covenant. And that's just the one aspect of that covenant that I'll just highlight at this point, that there's an aspect of it which means that God is going to keep it going, even though the other parties to the covenant, the human beings, mess up quite a bit and quite often.
I was going to say, that's the story of it, isn't it? We think of that history that you just sketched through. That's the people, the covenant people, not keeping their covenant and having these covenant enforcers coming at them all the time. And presumably you describe them as messengers a little bit as well, doesn't it? These messengers. So those writings, the writings that they write down, so the parts of the Bible that we typically think of as the prophets, that's presumably part of that, is it? These messages, that is how to understand that? Yeah,
so maybe let's just finish off what's in this section of the Hebrew Bible that's called the prophets. I said it's got Joshua, Judges, Samuel, Kings, and that's mostly narrative, and it's got prophets playing their roles as characters in that period. And then we've got two other sections, really, which are often called the major prophets and then the minor prophets. So the major prophets are Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel. So three big books of the writings of those prophets. And then you've got something called the Book of the 12, which in English Bibles is often called the minor prophets. It's not because they're less important, less significant. It's just because they're smaller, they're shorter books. And there's 12 of them. And in the Hebrew Bible, they tend to be called the Book of the 12. So there we are. So we've got Joshua through to Kings, and then we've got Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and then this Book of the 12. And there is this little hint in the history in Samuel and Kings. There's some groups of people living in communities called the sons of the prophets. There's just hints that there might be something called a school of the prophets. And so you get this sense that there was a community that was perhaps writing down the things that the prophets were saying, the messages that they had for the people of God. And that's part of how they became the books and the writings that we end up with in our Bibles. But having been through all of that, what's in this Nevi'im? There's someone missing. Who is that?
We put a pin in him, didn't we?
Yeah.
Where's Daniel?
Yeah, he's not in there. He's in the third section of the Hebrew Bible, the writings or the Ketuvim. But I think we can say he's an honorary prophet. We'll include him as in the prophets.
Yeah. Okay. Great. So we've mentioned quite a few now of these different prophets, and that they came with a message. What was it? How did that message come? What were they doing? What did they just stand up and speak in marketplaces and things? That they had that some people were writing it down.
The word for a prophet and to prophesy is Hebrew word navi, and it simply means to proclaim a message from God. It could be used about false prophets of other gods as well, as to proclaim a message from God. So it isn't really about what we might think in the English word prophecy as about prediction of the future. It is just proclaiming a message. We sometimes say that it's forthtelling the message of God, not just foretelling. There might be some foretelling and warning about what's going to happen, but that's incidental to the main purpose, which is proclaiming a message from God.
Yeah, okay. So any kind of message, and particularly to do with this covenant. And you gave some hints earlier as well about the way that they did this wasn't purely just stuff that they'd written down in a journalist's point of view, but it was also the protesters' point of view. They installed something in front of the king's courtyard, maybe, or did something audacious, maybe.
Yeah, and when in the New Testament, in the letter to the Hebrews, it starts, long ago, many times and in many ways, God spoke to our fathers by the prophets. So they've got a whole variety of ways of communicating. And often that includes their appearance, their persona, their actions. And Elijah there is this image of a hairy man with a garment of camel's hair and eating locusts and wild honey. And this kind of gets picked up by John the Baptist.
Yeah.
That kind of picture of a prophet. But others, Hosea and Isaiah, that we'll look at later, they get married and they have children, and their family and the situations of their wives and their children are part of their message and part of communicating their message. The prophet Ezekiel does all sorts of odd things. He lies on his side for days on end, representing the period of affliction and captivity. And he shaves off all his hair and his beard, and he cuts it up into sections, and some of it is burned, and some of it he chops up with a sword, and some of it's thrown to the wind. And all of this is acting out a warning of what's going to happen to the people of Israel if they don't listen to the message to come back to God.
Yeah, okay. We're going to be reading some of these prophets. That's why we're doing this. We're going to be picking up Isaiah and then the minor prophets as well, the book of the 12. So how should we approach them, or how have people been reading them?
Yeah, I suppose the first thing to say is that as you never get to the point where, okay, I know how to read the prophets. They're easy now. I've done what I need to do, and I've understood, and it's all a piece of cake. Don't think we ever really get to that point. There's always a lot to reflect on and meditate on and think about what the messages are of these prophets. And maybe the best thing for us to do is to pick up on some of those things as we actually go through some of the passages and we look at Isaiah and some of the minor prophets. In each of them, you can see immediately how they're relevant to Israel. And if you know that history, you can fit the message of a prophet at a particular time into what is about to happen or what's going on in the nation and the people of Israel at the time. We've got it here as part of a Hebrew Bible, something that we're picking up as Christians in the light of Jesus and the New Testament. We're not rejecting the Old Testament. It's very much something that we feel is still relevant to Christians today. So how do we pick it up as Christians to read it and understand? And I'll just highlight two common ways that the writings of the prophets might be used by later Christians. And both of them have their valid point, but also are maybe a little bit simplistic.
Okay.
So one way to look at the writings of the prophets and the message of these prophets to Israel is to say, now, in the Christian era, the church has replaced Israel. So what's going on is that we can take the words of these prophets and pretend that they're not written to Israel. They're not relevant to Israel anymore because Israel are out of the purpose of God, and not that's something that we would claim is true.
No.
But this point of view,
it's a very typical point of view.
The church has replaced Israel. I think it's sometimes called replacement theory.
Yeah.
Church has replaced Israel, so we read it as words to the church. And in fact, it's probably quite a common kind of 16th, 17th, 18th century Protestant point of view and way of reading the prophets. And if you look in the King James Version, there are little summaries in the King James Version of what the chapter is about to come. And I just, as an example, picked entirely at random from Isaiah chapter 41, the summary, or the part of the summary at the beginning of the chapter says, God expostulated with his people about his mercies to the church. And so that's the translators of the King James, where that little summary has come from, and they're very much saying this is not about Israel. These are not words to Israel, they're words to the church. So that's one approach. And you can see that's perhaps a little simplistic, might not always...
Yeah, and possibly might fall into the trap quite quickly of forgetting the high context nature of this communication, maybe.
Yeah. And I guess the second way that might be popular to read the prophets is to almost treat it as a coded message, and that embedded in all of this is there are predictions about how what Christians call the end times, the sort of eschatological times, and how events will unfold in the end times. And again, that's a little bit of a simplistic, yes, there may be some of that, but a bit simplistic to double down on that in its entirety.
Okay, so you've given these two common ways of reading the prophets, possibly with some caveats there. So is one right, is one wrong? Are they both sort of right? Or can we use the writings to predict the future, for example? Can we go to the prophets, these books that we've been talking about, and say, this is telling us exactly what's going to happen in the future? Is that, because that's what we generally think of when we, as English readers, that's what we expect.
Yeah, and I have found it really helpful to read and think about what the prophets are saying in the context of that covenant between God and his people. And because that's a concept that's relevant in the New Testament as well. There is a new covenant. So it's a transferable concept, if you like, from one context to another. And thinking about what's going on and what the prophets are doing in the context of that covenant, I've broken it down into seven kind of types of content that we come across when we're reading the prophets. And I think it's useful. I'll just run through the 7 in a moment, but I think it's just useful just to think, okay, I'm reading this passage in Amos or Isaiah or Malachi, whatever it is. Which of these 7 types of content is closest to what the prophet's doing here? And that just helps, I think, just to fit it into the overall picture. So here we go. So the first is the prophets often will just criticize the people of Israel for their idolatry, but what goes with that is injustice and exploitation of the vulnerable. So idolatry and injustice. So that's kind of part 1. Second part, what then comes next often, is an appeal to return to me, people, and things will be better for you. Return to me. That's number 2. The third one is warnings. That if you don't return to me, then we're warning you of something. And really, so there's the first 3, kind of speaking out against injustice and idolatry, and an appeal to return, and then warnings of. And I'd say the last 4, I'd group them all together under this concept of the day of the Lord. And I think it's helpful not to try and pin down that concept too much to one thing, because there are multiple different aspects of the day of the Lord. It's not always just termed as the day of the Lord. It might be in that day there will be blah, 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 or in that day this will happen, or in the latter days there will be something. And the 4 aspects that kind of I would group under this day of the Lord. The first is that because of their departure from the covenant, something bad's going to happen to Israel. A nation is going to afflict Israel. What goes with that, the next part, if you like, I think we're on to 5, is that this nation that afflicted Israel is then going to be punished for doing the things that they did to Israel. They went overboard in doing what they were doing to Israel. That's 4 and 5. And then the last 2, so number 6 is that there will be a remnant from Israel, from the people of God, that will be restored. And then finally, as part of the restoration of this remnant, it becomes clear that there are great blessings, but all nations are to be brought into those blessings. So there we go. We've got speaking out against injustice, return to me, warnings of this day of the Lord, which has got these 4 components to it. A nation afflicts Israel. That nation is then punished. A remnant is restored, but then all nations are to be included in the blessings of that restoration.
Okay, so that sounds good. In a minute, I'm going to just think about that passage from Amos that we looked at. Or maybe even now, I've got it in front of me. That sounds like it's the first one. So idolatry, but injustice really it's majoring on.
Yeah.
Who oppress the poor, who crush the needy. I can't see a return to me in there, appeal to return. There's definitely warnings though. And then possibly this whole idea of the day of the Lord, the days are coming upon you when they shall take you away with hooks, even the last of you fish hooks and so on. So this has the negativity side of it, I think.
And a little bit later in that chapter, so verse 9 says, I struck you with blight and mildew, your many gardens and your vineyards, your fig trees and your olive trees, the locust devoured. So there's that unfruitfulness kind of effect of the land. Yet you did not return to me.
Ah, okay. Yeah.
Declares the Lord. So it's there. Yeah. So I think with 7 types of content in the prophetic, I mean, inevitably it's an oversimplification.
Yeah.
But we do need an acronym.
Well, I was going to say, it's hard to remember, isn't it?
To remember those 7.
Because there's quite a few of them, so I'm not going to remember them all, Paul. So how am I going to remember these?
No. Let me help you with that, Dan. Because I have a pre-prepared acronym for those 7 things. And here we go. Here it is. In Red Wellingtons, I played rhythm and blues.
Oh,
so there you go. That's easy to remember. That's a mental picture that everyone wants to be left with. Injustice, idolatry. Red, return to me. Yeah, Wellingtons. Warning, W for warning. Israel is afflicted. Yeah, played.
It's the punishment.
The nation. So the nation that afflicted Israel is punished. Rhythm.
This is the remnant.
Yes, the remnant restored, and then blessings.
Yeah.
But nations brought into that. There we go.
Yeah, okay, good.
So that's made it all straightforward.
Absolutely, that's cleared a lot of things up. Yeah, and it is all about this covenant that even though Israel break it effectively, fail to keep their side, the covenant is kept by God.
Yes, it keeps going.
Yeah, the blessings will come. Yeah. So what sort of approach is this that you're suggesting then? Is that, I suppose there's some element there of being able to learn from that and apply it to the church today. So there's a bit of that in there. It's also talking about the future as well. So are you taking the best of both of those two different approaches?
Inevitably, as I said, those two, I think, and the way I described them is an oversimplification. Yeah. So yes, we're going to see combinations of that. But perhaps it's helpful to think about what the writings of the prophets and the whole situation that they're speaking into is telling us about God and about how God's covenant is going to continue despite human failure. And God will find a way to preserve a remnant and to restore that remnant, and through that to bring blessings on all nations, which was the terms of the original covenant with Abraham. The part of the promise to Abraham was that in him all nations would be blessed. And perhaps ultimately we see that leading to Jesus, and the sufferings of the prophets are then mirrored in the life and the death of Jesus. And Jesus becomes very much a fulfillment of the words of the prophets. But that's, as you just read the prophets on their own and talk and read about the day of the Lord and the deliverance and so on, you don't necessarily think, yeah, that's going to be a Jesus type figure that's going to fulfill that. It doesn't jump out as that, and it's not clear, and it's unexpected to the people at the time of Jesus when Jesus appears. And I guess all we can do, and finish this off by saying, well, let's just approach with a little bit of circumspect humility about how we can use the words of prophets to say, yes, we know what God's going to do in the future.
Great. That's a helpful thing to remember as we go through this. Thanks a lot, Paul. There's lots there and lots to come. So we're going to move next and look at Isaiah. And it's going to be an intro, a book overview of Isaiah. But because Isaiah is so big, it's going to be a two-parter. So there we go. That's what we're aiming to do, is to think about the book of Isaiah. And as we do that, we will be picturing Red Wellingtons. In Red Wellingtons, I played rhythm and blues. So that's what we've got to remember as we go through. Okay, so thank you all for listening. You can find out more always at biblefeed.org, catch us on Facebook and other socials. Have a look, check us out on YouTube, and see you next time.